Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Del Beccaro, and welcome to Politics in Perspective. As the summer races by, the midterms come into focus. The Democrats have a civil war with their socialist wing, and the Republicans are having a fight with affordability. Who will win in November? Well, that's to be seen. But on today's show, we're going to cover why the Democrats can't stop the DSA Democrats. Of course, I'm referring to the establishment Democrats. We'll also have an interview with Mark Mex, president of the National Right to Work Committee. And we're going to talk about unions, their influence, and potential, benefiting from fraud in California. That's a big issue. We'll also be talking in our political roundup about the stories of the day. I'll give you my quick takes on the latest from Fauci and several other topics. But let's get started with my thoughts on why the Democrats can't stop the DSA Democrats. So, what do I mean by this? Well, I wrote an op ed for Fox, and there's some confusion out there because I'm sure you have seen that this is being covered on all the networks, even the left of center, what the DSA stands for. And you have these calls from everyone from James Carville and on saying, well, the Democrats have to stop the DSA from redefining the Democrat Party. The problem is the parties aren't as powerful as they used to be. As most of you know, I was chairman of the California Republican Party, 100 years ago in 2011. And by then, the whole political world changed. And it actually changed in 2010. In 2010, of course, there was a Supreme Court case that's referred to as Citizens United. And there's a lot to talk about with that particular issue. But the reality is the funding of elections would never be the same following Citizens United. Prior to Citizens United, it was pretty stable how elections were funded. The parties were a very big player. They were the modern day super PAC. They got the money. They had conventions, state and national, and they endorsed. And as the money came in, they used to support their parties. Not all states did that, but certainly at the national level, the DNC, Democrat National Committee, and the RNC, the Republican National Committee, were the big players. Now, of course, unions have always been a big player as well. We'll talk about that in our second segment. But unions, which are corporations, used to be able to, still do, but were really the sole corporations that spent big on elections. And then Citizens United came along. And the Supreme Court said you cannot limit entities from spending money with artificial limits. And so now that meant from that moment forward, and this was the Supreme Court in 2010, what happened was the funding of elections changed forever. Not immediately in effect, but 16 years later, we have this dramatic difference. I chose the picture of Mondami, actually, Fox chose that, because he is a good example of how things change. Today, we live in what I call the age of the super PAC. There are super PACs all over. I have a super PAC, electionfairness.com. And things have changed because of the super PAC. Now, huge amounts of money go to the super PACs, and those super PACs on both sides of the aisle pick what candidates they like and they don't like. And they spend gobs of money, literally in the hundreds of millions to billions in any 4-year cycle, to say this election should be covered and this candidate should win, or They say which one shouldn't. And the parties have retreated in power. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that the money isn't going to the parties anywhere near it used to go. In fact, if you've been following along, you have heard that the Democrat National Committee is broke, 30 million in debt. They took a loan out on their building in Washington, D.C., and that'll have to be paid back by some donor sooner or later. But they don't have a lot of money. But the Democrats aren't really worried about that. Why? Because they're super PACs. In fact, these super PACs don't trust the DNC to spend the money wisely. In fact, the DNC's had some problems for years as to who's been running it. And as a result, these super PACs are getting the money and they're funding the candidates of their choice. Consider Mandami. Mandami got his money from non-establishment Democrat officials. What do I mean by that? Or persons. He ran against the establishment. The Democrats were backing Cuomo. Now, Cuomo wasn't the best of candidates, but that's who the Democrats wanted. And in the old days, that would have meant he was endorsed by the party and got the money. But with super PACs, Mandami was able to get, or the super PAC spent nearly $2 million to his favor, saying you should elect Mandami to make New York more affordable. That never would have existed 15 years ago. And he became the nominee with the help of that super PAC. It is very unlikely without that $2 million that he would have defeated Cuomo. Possible, but unlikely. Take El Said. El Said, who decries money in politics, so it's a bad thing. Bernie Sanders says that too, but they take the money. So, but Said's particularly phony because he decries money in politics, yet his father, who has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood fundraising, his father put 300,000, no small amount, in a super PAC that helped his son. Now, prior to Citizens United, he couldn't have spent that 300,000 on behalf of his son because that would have been illegal. But he put it in a super PAC, and that's how Said benefited from the super PAC and became the nominee. The long and the short of this is that the DSA is using super PAC money to do what it's doing. It never would have been able to get here without those super PACs. It never would have been able to get here without Citizens United, which weakened the power of political parties. So now the DSA candidates aren't running with the endorsement of the local parties. They are in some cases, but certainly not the national party and not in some states. But they're using super PAC money to succeed. So, to sum up this portion of the show, the reason why the Democrats cannot get rid of the DSA is because the DSA doesn't need the party anymore. The party is weak. Anybody can run as a Democrat. I could sign up to run as a Democrat tomorrow in California for a race. You can't restrict somebody's right to register as a Democrat or a Republican. So when you combine that with the weakened parties, you get DSA candidates claiming to be Democrats. And if we go to the next slide, remember, last show we talked about that there are 10 major issues in which the Democrats and the DSA are very similar. Green New Deal, universal health care, open borders, on and on and on. So the DSA candidate signs up as a Democrat. Bernie Sanders, the socialist, has been doing that for years in Vermont. runs as a socialist, but also runs as a Democrat. But the DSA is redefining Democrats to a great degree with their crazy ideas, but they're doing it within the party. Parties are weak. The money goes to super PACs, and the DSA is taking advantage of it. And there's almost nothing the Democrats can do about it. And this is a big deal because if we go to the next slide, remember this: communism begins where private property ends. That was the great historian Will Durant, who taught me how to analyze history. And my thought is, now compare the controls government had over property in 1789 to today. There was no tax on your income because that was thought to be controlling your property. There was no property taxes because that would have been controlling your property. Think of all the regulations affecting how you make money and what you can do with your property. Government is taking control year by year over property. And the DSA and their candidates and many Democrats want to put in wealth taxes. That's actually just taking your property without compensation. That's a big deal. That's where America is today. And in the next episode, I'm going to talk about why private property is so very important. Well, that's my opening segment. I encourage you to join me on Substack. You can go to tomdell.com and see my latest articles and interviews. I'm also on Twitter and even some Instagram, but I hope you'll buy my book, The Lessons of the American Civilization. And 11 years ago, my book, The Divided Era, came out, which explains how the more government decides, the more it divides. I'm Tom Del Beccaro. That's my opening statement, and we'll be right back with more Politics in Perspective. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Politics in Perspective. I'm Tom Del Beccaro. You know, it's the 11th anniversary of my book, The Divided Era. And part of the reason we are so divided as a country, as I wrote in the book, is the competition for spoils from government. And that is our biggest national competition. We've exchanged big stadiums in some degree for the Coliseum known as Washington, D.C., and all of the spoils. And public employee unions sit right in the middle of that. And so I thought it'd be great to bring on Mark Mix, who is with a great organization. How are you, Mark? Welcome.
Doing fine, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this issue. And you're right, man. This is rent seeking on steroids.
So why don't you, if you could start off by telling my viewers what your organization does, and why it's so important.
Yeah, Tom, we've got two organizations. I'll just go through them quickly. We have the National Right to Work Committee, which has been around since 1955, and that is our lobbying organization. That's a 501c4. We track legislation, monitor legislation, and take action on legislation in all 50 states and in the United States Congress. So there's a lot of work to be done there. I mean, we track 6,000 or 7,000 bills each year in each legislative session. And Tom, to your point, most of those bills have something to do with public sector unions and increasing their growth. So that's the legislative side of our work. We protect our right to work laws. We have 26 states that have right to work laws on the books. And so a primary objective is to save those and preserve those and obviously pass more. And then work with Congress to try to reform the federal law that really is kind of the foundation of union power in America. And Back in the 1930s, it was the private sector, but obviously that model of confrontation, zero sum, and kind of a really neat way to control government has migrated into the public sector, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The second organization is the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, and we've been around since 1968. We litigate on behalf of employees whose rights have been violated by forced unionism. A lot of that litigation is public sector litigation, defending teachers and public employees across the country from the power of government unions. And I should say expanding power of government unions. The good news is there's been some things that have happened that have kind of reduced their power a little bit. But the most important about that, Tom, that you spoke about in the introduction, is to kind of get this message out to more people about what those rights may do and how they may affect the power of government unions across the country. We've argued 18 cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of individual employees looking to not only protect their rights, but expand rights to others across the country to set a precedent that will help other workers. As we talk today, based on our last Board of Trustees meeting, our legal director reports, we have 298 active cases on behalf of employees across the country.
Wow.
Various venues, whether it be in federal court, state court, whether it be in front of regulatory bodies. Like we've got a case right now on behalf of agricultural workers in California, trying to strike down a dramatic increase in power for the unions over agricultural workers. We've got, I think, 20 plaintiffs in that case. There's a state case and a federal case we're arguing. So there's a lot of work to do, and it does, unfortunately, deal more and more with public sector union power.
Yeah, I think, America doesn't specialize in teaching history to its students and otherwise, but this really is a tale of two half centuries. For the Industrial Revolution, of course, the private unions came about, and that's where union growth was. That's where the rank and file was. But since the 1970s, with the explosion of government, the explosion of spending, I don't think most Americans understand that the private sector union participation percentages drop precipitously, and almost all the growth, is it not, is in public employee unions.
Yeah, indeed. When you talk about the 1950s, kind of the apex of union density in the private sector, they were around 53, 35, 36%. Today, they're down to 5.9% in the private sector workforce. But to your point, Tom, unfortunately, like happens oftentimes, California was the leader of this. And I have to say this kind of openly and a little bit reservedly, but it was Ronald Reagan who signed that bill in California in 1968 that said local governments can bargain. And then it didn't take long for the union bosses in California to expand it to teachers and the school system, and then apply it to every government employee agency in California. And to your point, those years, the Jerry Brown years of 75, 76, to your point, that was kind of the apex of public sector push for these legislative privileges. And boy, it hasn't gotten any better really since then. There's been a few edges taken off of it, but the growth in the public sector unions is really where we are. In fact, the AFL-CIO, which is the umbrella for 60 unions, international unions, they tout 14 million members. 7 million are public sector workers, 7 million are private sector workers. So it is the final frontier for organized labor, is the government sector.
So just to be clear, though, did not JFK put at the federal level collective bargaining prior to Reagan?
Yeah, that was the executive order in 1963, I think it was, Executive Order 10001 or something, saying he was going to allow union bargaining for federal employees. So yeah, let me take back a little bit of the curse you California narrative, and Kennedy kind of started that process about how maybe this was an appropriate means of negotiating with government employees. But Tom, probably that Roosevelt was asked this question back when they unionized the private sector back in the 1930s, and he was asked specifically about the public sector and government workers, and he said, it's unthinkable. It's not the same. The market pressures are not the same. In the private sector, you have this pressure on, losing market share, losing profitability, all these things that the private market demands of success or, the continuation of a private enterprise. Those conditions don't exist in the public sector. And again, you in California, you guys know this better than most, that the cost of government can expand dramatically, even when government services are deteriorating, and pension plans are overwhelming the state budget, et cetera. So yeah, the private sector is where it started. Roosevelt, or excuse me, Kennedy got to it with federal government employees, but then California, like oftentimes, expanded it across the country. This manifest destiny to the east, if you will.
Yeah. So I was chairman of the California Republican Party. I knew well the power of public employee unions. And if you'll forgive me for this analogy, uh, the mafia had rackets going where they pressured you into buying their goods and then taxed you. In the public sector employee unions, it's really quite remarkable because it's right there in your face.
Yeah.
If we bring up a quote from my friend John Fleischman, who's been on the show about the power of these unions, what you find is that these public employee unions negotiate directly with government officials, John says, whose campaign they often help finance and whose election they often helped influence. Now, I think he's being kind here because what happens in California is they take public employee unions take taxpayer money, right? Because that goes into the government.
Yep.
Then it is paid to the teacher or the person, highway patrolman, or the person fixing the highway. And then they're required to give money back to the union for lobbying. It's quite a racket, is it not?
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle, Tom, and it's not. It's people don't see it that way, and you spelled it out very simply. But look, when you go to Sacramento and you watch a committee hearing, and I know you've been there and others have been there, when you see AFSCME union officials and SEI union officials kind of giving the stink eye to a legislator who says anything that might be contrary to union power, and this kind of stink eye says, you know who elects you, don't you? Because the government employees pour that money into the political process. And it's like King Arthur. I mean, King Arthur allegedly had this round table, so everybody had equal voices. Well, the bargaining structure usually asks you have a square table. You have one side on one side and one side on the other. And that doesn't exist anymore in the public sector because in California, it is the round table. And these politicians that are elected with this union cash, and these, Tom, make no mistake, you know this, but government sector employee unions are the biggest contributors to politics. I mean, we talk about the Soroses of the world and the tech bros and the Kochs and all that. I mean, they're pikers compared to what the public sector employee unions spend on politics. And frankly, it makes sense. I mean, they are a creation of the political process. They're wards of government. Their power is a function of government activity. So you better know who the boss is if you're going to maintain your power or expand it. And they know that story very, very well.
So in my first segment, I talked about how Citizens United changed politics forever because we live in the age of the super PAC. But one thing that is, I think, underplayed, I love your comment on it, is prior to Citizens United, there were a lot of corporations that spent big in politics because most unions are incorporated. They're not proprietorships. Citizens United allowed other corporations to spend in politics. Your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, that's all interesting, and we had to reform it. But remember this, Tom, and you know this as well. Corporations generally support 60% to the party that's in power, 40% to the next party, just in case something strange happens in the elections. Union officials are all in on one party. They are focused and they are laser focused on Democrat control of state legislatures and executive branches across the country because they know, once again, that their power is a derivative of government action. Corporations are hedging their bets. Union officials are all in, one vote, $1. We know who it goes to. And very rarely do they support, quote, Republicans, even though Republicans are kind of to blame for this problem as well, without doubt.
Okay, so I remember in California this issue of home care and having paying people to take care of the elderly or the disabled, and instead of moving them in their home, instead of moving them to a facility, And the thought was, just on the surface, if you think about this, the thought was, well, if why have an individual as a infirm parent go to work, pay tax, da da da? Why not pay them to stay home? And on the surface, it sounds good intentions, but life is reality. And that law passed with a lot of union help because, and I argued this at the time, this is their next step isn't just, oh, we're going to help the infirm here. No, they're going to unionize the entire thing. And if you could sort of expand on that and get people to understand that one of the reasons unions want more people, there's what, 23 million nationwide in government. They're not just out, they're out there to grow numbers, not solve the deficit or your standard of living per se.
Yeah, Tom, to your point earlier, they're a business too, and their revenue is union dues money. And so, okay, you create a business model that increases revenue. Every company wants to do that. Every small business wants to do that. You want to lower cost. Well, they don't want necessarily lower costs. Some private businesses want to lower costs and increase revenue. Unions want to increase expenses because that increases their revenue. So the incentives are different in the public sector, to your point. On the home health care provider status, you got to start with what they had to do first to get this power. And they had to change the definition of home health care providers from W-2 employees, meaning independent contractors, to public sector employees. Now, that definition doesn't include making them public sector employees for the purposes of negotiating vacation, benefits, sick time, all this other stuff that regular private or public sector employees would negotiate with the state of California or with the local school district. So they just wanted to get them unionized to the point so they could collect dues through the Medicare system. So they got that definition changed. These people became public employees. Now you have a group that can be unionized. Let's think of Lyft drivers. Let's think of AB5. Let's think of Uber drivers in California. You know, you're shaking your head. I can see you. You know the story. If you can take them from being independent contractors to employees, you can unionize employees. You can't unionize independent contractors. So there's the start. So now you get them redefined, and then you say they're public employees for purposes of bargaining. And then the state, who receives Medicaid money from the federal government, gets a finite bucket of money. And all of a sudden, oh, wow, hey, there's a real opportunity here. We can make those providers pay a fee. We can get in between the Medicaid money and the recipient, which is actually a violation of federal law. There's a federal statute that says direct payment, you can't get in between. But union officials in California and 10 other states have got waivers of saying they can get in and they can actually get part of that money to go to the provider, and then that provider has to pay union dues or fees in order to continue the service. We argued this case in the U.S. Supreme Court, Tom, in 2014, a case called Harris v. Quinn, Quinn being the governor of California, Pam Harris being a mom who was taking care of her developmentally disabled child in her home because that care could occur in the home. They could keep the child in the home to make sure they got a stipend to provide for some services. And the union said, Pam, the mother of the child, had to pay the union in order to take care of her child. And she kind of laughed about it at the beginning. She said, you mean I can go on strike? And she kind of laughed and chuckled and said, yeah, no, you can't. The only privilege that you have was to pay the union money. So she stood up, and a couple of other mothers in similar situations did. We took the case in the Seventh Circuit, and basically we went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Back in June 30th, 2014, the Supreme Court said, no, these aren't employees for purposes of unionization. You can't force them to pay dues. That's the law of the land today when it comes to healthcare providers. Then in 2018, we won the Janus case, which said no government employee can be forced to pay dues or fees to keep their job if they're working for government. And so the Harris case and the Janus case provide a foundation for any government employee, whether it be a home health care provider, a teacher, a fireman, a police officer, no matter who it is, can get out of payment of union dues. But your point, Tom, again, about the education of this and making this more visible to people is a really important part of that project, too. So they have the protections, but this is how it all got going. And it's always, what is it? Follow the money. I'm not Latin, sir. I can't speak Latin or read it or practice. I didn't take Latin, but there's some kind of
Yes,
cute
but
saying that says, follow the money.
yeah, and this is the ultimate other people's money. Milton
Yeah.
Friedman used to talk about you're careful spending your own on yourself. You're a little less careful spending your own on someone else. And there's no careful when someone else is spending money on someone else. And so This is the unions bargaining with Democrat officials in California to spend our money, and there's seemingly no limitation to this. And I think this is part of what is going on with Medicaid fraud in California. They're willing to appropriate, but not follow up on where the money actually goes, other than to make sure the unions get the money. Is that somewhat accurate? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I would say that I would like to use the word fraud because it seems to be a fraud, but there is a legal protection, if you will, a legal authorization for this due skim in those states that are doing, despite the fact that the Medicare regulations and the, as I mentioned, the direct payment statute for Medicaid funds is on the books. So Obama created it. Trump fixed it and Trump won and said, no, we're not going to do this. You can't do this anymore. Biden obviously came back in and said, no, we're going to reopen that waiver. We're going to let the unions collect this money. Trump has not fixed it yet. But Dr. Oz has actually sent a letter to those states, including California, and saying, hey, I want to know how you're treating this union dues skim in your state because it's probable and likely, although, Tom, it's hard to believe. I mean, we're on the downhill side of the Trump administration right now. I mean, we've had to wait 2 years for lots of things to change, and that's because of, the gridlock and all that. And believe me, I'm a big fan of gridlock when it comes to legislatures and governments, because that means they're not doing anything. And gridlock is good generally, Tom. But this stuff is going on, and the numbers, the dollar amounts are staggering. I mean, you're talking
Yeah.
between 2000 and 2017, home health care workers kicked over about $1.4 billion to unions. And then back to your point, Tom, that money gets cycled back into the political process to elect more politicians that give them more power, which gives them more dues.
Yeah. So I want to go back to two things. You said that Soros and the others are pikers compared to public employee unions, and you just hit on a number.
Yeah.
We spent, I think, in the 2016 to 2020, like 6 billion, 7 billion in the 4-year cycle on politics,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
And unions spent probably a third of it nationwide, including the states. People need to get that. I also think I don't want you to brush by the incredible importance of Janus'
Yeah.
decision, but also could you describe for my listeners how many people that affected, meaning who chose to live in a degree of freedom?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, going back, let me start with Janice, the second question first. We believe, and based on work that other groups have done, like Freedom Foundation and others doing, opt-out campaigns, we have obviously an opt-out campaign that's still running, and we're kind of into the blocking and tackling phase of this, Tom. The shine has worn off, but there's still a ton of work to do. Janice is important. We believe that it's cost the unions up to $1 billion a year in revenue. And initially, right after the Supreme Court signed off on the fact that this was a First Amendment constitutional speech right that couldn't be violated by the unions, and workers could get out of the payment of anything to unions. I mean,
Okay, could you please stop right there? It's a constitutional right, because what the unions were doing was taking your money, the workers' money, and advocating to the opposite of the workers' views, and they had previously had no right to stop it.
That's right. That's exactly right. This was a speech issue, First Amendment speech issue. We want to expand that and make it an associational issue too, but the speech issue was the First Amendment protections that were granted by the court in Janus, saying that money is speech and you can't force them to support ideological, political, whatever causes they disagree with. You just can't do it. So the number in the public sector is zero. You can not be forced to pay anything. Getting back to and having people understand those rights is really an important project and an ongoing project. Is talk about political money. You said $4 billion over a 4-year cycle. Well, we know this from studying the union reports they file, whether it be lobbying reports or political reports. They spend $2 billion every 2 years on politics. So if you take your 4-year model, they're spending $4 billion themselves on politics. Zuckerberg and these guys spend hundreds of millions. But when you start talking about billions, I mean, I know that doesn't sound like a lot of money anymore, Tom, because we're in the trillions, and what's next? Quadrillion? Is that the next? I forget what the next hierarchy is when it comes to what we're going to be in debt, or what California's going to be in debt in your pension system in some point in the future. But it's big money. And it goes to support this legislative privilege, whether it be in the private sector for private sector workers through Congress, or whether it be in public sector under state law that gives union officials this power. And it's out of all proportion to their numbers, and it's out of all proportion to anything else that we would seem to be reasonable in this idea that we get to redress government. I mean, they're sitting at a round table with compulsory money, with your money, taxpayer money, as you mentioned so effectively. I mean, it's taxpayer money that's being used and turned around to influence government.
So if we look ahead, uh, virtually every state has enormous debt, right? The
Yeah,
blue states especially.
yeah,
We saw in COVID where California didn't pay back its COVID loan, and so now employers are paying it. But we're going to get to defaults and federal bailouts, and so what do you see ahead for this dynamic where they're spending roughly a third of all money that gets spent in politics? Is there an end game here? Is there a way to curtail this? Tell us what you're doing and what you see ahead.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of ambiguity here, Tom. And let me start with a private sector model. The Teamsters Union and the multi-employee pensions of unions across the country got bailed out by the Biden administration to the tune of $94 billion. That was money that went to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to bail out, which basically were union pension funds. The Teamsters themselves, who were literally at a critical state where legislation had passed and Teamster pensioners were getting a 70% cut across the board on their pension benefits, literally were facing the probability that the Teamster pension fund would fail. Well, Biden, during the American Cares Act, or whatever it was called, I mean, they all have great sounding names, but do dramatic devastation to the country, bailed out the pensions to a tune of $94 billion. The Teamsters unions, whether it be the central state or the western states or the local unions, got something like $45 billion worth of, and these are private sector employees, Tom. So take that and extrapolate it. When a state gets so fiscally insolvent, what's the government going to do? Well, you've got Stockton, you've got Vallejo, you've got one other, I think, municipality out there literally filed bankruptcy, right? They went broke. And it was because of the pension rules that are negotiated with government unions that apparently are going to get worse, because CalPERS had a great quote unquote investment year last year, and CalSTRS, which is the teacher one, had a similar investment return. So now you're going to increase payments with your COLA increases, your mandatory COLA increases, and with probably pension reforms that are going to say now, well, geez, we got plenty of money. We're 85% funded now in CalPERS, and what is it, 86% funded in your CalSTRS pension fund. So everything's honky-dory for the next year or two until the market, Tom, melts down and has a negative return. And oh boy. So what are we going to do? They will come to the federal government, and the first in is going to be the lucky ones, because the state will probably say, we got to do that. The federal government say we got to do it. But at some point, it's default. And we have yet to have a state go default. We've had cities like Chicago maybe next, perhaps. New York City maybe next. But when a state comes to the point where your pension liability and your cost of government, in the teachers, in the education sector in California, declining enrollment, increased cost, that can't go on forever. So at some point, there's going to have to be a bailout or some kind of radical reform of the bargaining laws. And hopefully that's the solution. They go back in like Scott Walker did in Wisconsin with Act 10, even though they didn't get rid of bargaining, and it's likely the Wisconsin Supreme Court's going to restore it here shortly, perhaps. They saved over $30 billion since the implementation of Act 10 in Wisconsin, just by saying, we're not bargaining over anything but pay, and where that pay is going to be limited by cost of living, and that'll be what we negotiate over. But everything else is elected officials. We're going to go back to a constitutional republic where we loan our power to our legislators, and if they don't do the right thing, we take it back from them, as opposed to some kind of weird democracy that says union officials have power above, almost equal to a sovereign. Literally, that's what we're talking about in California. They almost have powers equal to the sovereign in the state of California, because, oh boy, if you don't do exactly what they want, the schools shut down. If you don't do exactly what they want, perhaps the police officers don't show up to work or have a blue flu. If you don't do what they want, we've seen this in states where firefighters say, we're not going to go respond to a fire call. I hope the employees in California don't do that, the firefighters and police. I hope they never have the choice of having to do that. But if that happens, I think the only reform is dramatically rolling back not only Reagan's signing of that bill in 68, but the Rada bill in 75 and the Gray Davis bills in 99 and whatever else the California legislature has in store for taxpayers in your state. There's got to be radical reform.
Yeah, you see that the market is doing well. I've said that to administration officials and others that one of the untold stories is that state pension funds are becoming flush with this market rise because of Trump. But what we're seeing in California isn't, oh, we're at 84% to this arbitrary cutoff year, which I think is a whole different issue because, you
Right.
know, the union pensions are a remarkable thing. It's like having employees for the rest of your life, but they don't do anything,
Yep.
which is an unsustainable model. But instead of a rainy day fund or anything like this, California's granting them more benefits and increasing benefits to one group, and then everyone else is going to come to the table and they will have compounded the problems. Okay, so we're running out of time. Tell us, either group you're working with, what your big mission is during the Trump administration while you have a friendly year.
Yeah. Well, most importantly is to kind of roll back some of the things the Biden administration did when it came to employee rights at the National Labor Relations Board. This is the 5-member board that adjudicates labor policy for private sector workers. And I got to tell you, the damage done during the Obama years and during the Biden years has set back precedent literally thousands of years when it comes to the rights that individual employees should have in the private sector. We're not having much luck there. The board just got filled out to a point where they can overturn precedent. In fact, last week during the en banc passage of Trump nominees, the final NLRB member, one Democrat, one Republican, were confirmed, and now they're operating on the board. So, but again, Tom, as I mentioned, we're on the downhill side of the, and now politics comes into play because we got the 28 election for president coming up. State legislatures, we've made some real progress reforming the bargaining laws in states like Idaho and Tennessee and Alabama and states where, you know, the fiscal reality of this power of unionized government has occurred and is now visible to taxpayers. Wisconsin is another state where we got to defend Act 10 up there. So working in the states, rolling back the power of government unions, passing new right to work laws. We're trying in Montana and New Hampshire and a couple other states to add to our list of 26 states that have right to work laws across the country today. And we'll see if we can make some progress as we move into November of this year and change some state legislatures, change Congress a little bit, and continue to work. But all of our work is only made possible by courageous individuals that have the courage to stand up and fight. We can't do it ourselves. We do it with these individuals that stand up, and we do it with the support of lots of generous people across the country that make it all possible. So I'm grateful for not only the courage of many employees and citizens across the United States, but also those that support our work.
Yeah, so one thing I want people to understand, your fight isn't just, is it technical in some ways, it's about particular laws, it's this, that, and the other thing. But at the end of the day, your work also deals with the solvency of the United States. We can't go on in this way, and so your fight is, you know, if you, how worse would inflation be in 20 years if you didn't exist? That kind of thing.
Yeah, Tom, I tend to want to be optimistic about things all the time. And I couldn't wake up each morning and do this work if I didn't think we were going to make a difference and we weren't going to make an ultimate difference when it comes to freedom in the workplace and liberty in the workplace. We got a good group of attorneys sitting behind this wall back here that are litigating these cases on behalf of these employees, and we're making progress. And that's gratifying, and it keeps us in the fight. And, you know, I appreciate what you're doing, because making this more public and more transparent about the work that we do and others that I know you talk to as well, it's really critical we stay optimistic, we stay hopeful, because that's the only solution in this grand experiment in self-government, is that we understand it as we the people. It's we the people. You know,
All
we
right,
got
so
problems
where
from here. Yeah.
all right, so where should people go to help you out?
Yeah, if they want to go to have questions about their legal rights, they can go to the foundation's website, nrtw.org, O-R-G. And if they want to know about what's going on legislatively, whether it be California, Sacramento, Washington, D.C., wherever, they can go to the committee's website, nrtwc.org. And if they want to exercise their rights under the Janus decision, they can go to myjanusrights.org and get an attorney to help them get out and pay zero to those government unions that are doing the types of things that you're talking about in California and across the country, Tom.
All right, Mark. Thanks so very much for coming on today. We'll check back within you later in the year, or perhaps next year, to see your progress.
Thanks, Tom. I
So,
appreciate the opportunity. Yep.
all right, we'll be back with more of Politics in Perspective. Welcome back to Politics in Perspective. It's a big issue. Union money, self-dealing. They take your taxpayer dollar. They lobby the officials that they elected, and you're left off the table. And Mark's organization is big in a lot of ways, including granting freedom to public employee union members who don't want to support that activity. So each week I try and bring you someone who has some difference they're making. That's why I call it the Difference Maker interview. All right, let's go to our political roundup today. We're going to start with Fauci. I mean, it was bad enough, pleading the fifth, all of that. But then to find out that remember, he had a heart condition, he withheld that. But then they knew there were red flags related to pregnancy. There was actually information on the internet. The Hasidic community did not go along with the jab because they had learned this issue related to pregnancy. There was information out there. And Fauci, bald-faced, lied about it. He lied, and babies died. And miscarriages are heartbreaking. Heartbreaking for the family. A woman who wants a child never forgets a miscarriage, ever. They carry it their whole lives. And the fact that Fauci was willing to lie about that, again, you should not place your trust in government. One of the biggest mistakes in history is for individuals to believe that people involved in government have greater virtues than the people in the private sector. Fauci didn't have virtue. He didn't. This was about power. Anybody who says the Republicans don't like to follow government, we got to break them of that habit. What does that tell you? And who was he willing to sacrifice to get that way? And did he commit malpractice? Not telling patients what's going on, the truth. I think so. All right, next. So, 3, 2, 1. El-Sayed, this guy is quite the character, is he not? So I picked this picture. There's him walking in Michigan on Mackinac Island. Now, if you've never been there, I haven't. Look, Google it, search it, excuse me, DuckDuckGo. Do the images. It's gorgeous. Flat out gorgeous. It is quintessential America. Its major hotel is said to have the largest porch in America. And El-Sayed, there's a picture of him walking along. There was video where he says he hates the place. Now, who really hates a place? I mean, look, I've been a lot of places in the world. I don't hate a place. I may not like it. And if I go somewhere once and I didn't like it, I don't go back. I don't hate. He hates it. He said he hates it. Why does he hate it? Because it's quintessential American culture. It is. It's storybook. It's a postcard of America. And El Sayed and his family don't like America. Period, full stop. America is a place of freedom, beauty, and a heritage. He didn't like any of those things. Don't be fooled. Oh, I didn't mean it. Really? Really? You didn't defund the police? You didn't mean it? You didn't like 4th of July fireworks? You didn't mean it? America can't fall for these liars. Continuing, next up with Mr. El Sayed. There he is there, saying that this universal health care, it turns out, is going to cost more than just taxing the wealthy. The middle class has to pay for it too. Really? So, look, in this case, at least he's honest. He's telling you, we're going to get rid of private health care, even though the majority of Americans like the private health care they have. We're going to get rid of it, and we're going to charge you, and then you're going to get government health care. That's where he's at. That's where DSA's at. That's the Big Ten. Remember, the Democrats said they're the Big Ten party. They can have these views. Well, keep in mind, in '94, Hillary essentially wanted to do that. Ridiculous. We can't afford it. We just did a whole segment about the United States in debt. We can't afford to do what he's talking about. And hopefully there's a poll out showing Rogers 5 points ahead. Let's hope it stays that way. Next up. My good friend Kamala Harris. Remember, I ran against her in 2016. The Democrat Party needs to get comfortable with a certain kind of ruthlessness. Really? The Democrats aren't ruthless? We just went through how public employee unions strong arm and spend your money. There's all the issues among Democrats related to election integrity. They want to get rid of the filibuster. They want to get rid of the Electoral College. And she's just now saying they need to, quote unquote, get comfortable with it? What else are they going to do? I shouldn't ask that question. It's pretty obvious what they can do. All right, last slide, and we'll talk about this. I actually don't know who this woman is, but if you see her on Facebook, she has some great stuff. So to the left is a building Trump built for, I think it's $877 million, and in the lower right is Obama's. I don't know how to describe his building, but it looks like a prison to me. So on the left, on my Facebook page, I say capitalism and socialism in one picture. On the left is what a capitalist builds, and on the right is what a socialist builds and still doesn't pay all of the bills related to that particular building. I don't know. I think that's America right there. And that's your choice going forward, because what socialism is conformity. And with conformity, you destroy incentives. And when you destroy incentives, the entire system starts to collapse. The economy stagnates. People are worse off. And you get buildings like that. Or we can continue to change the world with American-style capitalism. Anyway, that's our show for this week. Please, if you can, buy my books, The Lessons of the American Civilization, which discusses in Chapter 10, America, capitalism, and socialism, how we got here, and why capitalism remains so important. See me on Substack. My article this week will be why private property is so important. I'm Tom Del Beccaro. This has been Politics in Perspective.